I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything and go stay in a remote cabin for a while. This was in the fall of 2022. I just finished a grueling few years working in construction management in Boston, and I was burned out, like completely. I wasn't sleeping right. My chest would get tight for no reason. I'd get up in the middle of the night and just sit at the kitchen table staring at the wall. The company offered me some time off, and I didn't think twice about taking it. I found the cabin online through a small site that mostly listed places in New Hampshire and Vermont. I was looking for something very remote, something surrounded by trees where I wouldn't hear cars or people. I wanted silence, solitude. The place I ended up picking was a small, square log cabin tucked in the woods just outside of Colebrook, New Hampshire. It was about 4 miles from the nearest road and could only be accessed by a narrow dirt trail that wound through thick forest. The listing said it had been used by hunters and trappers for years, but had been updated a bit in 2018 with solar panels and a new wood stove. It didn't have running water or cell service, but it had a radio and a composting toilet in a little shed 20 feet behind the cabin. That was good enough for me. I packed my things over the course of a week. I brought mostly canned food, water containers, a few tools, a small generator with some fuel, a good axe, clothes, boots, and a few books. The plan was to stay 2 weeks, maybe more if I felt like it. The guy who owned the cabin met me at a gas station on the edge of town and gave me the key, along with a crude hand-drawn map showing how to get to the place. He didn't talk much, just pointed at the map and then pointed at me and nodded. He looked like he'd done a lifetime in the woods. His truck was mud-stained and smelled like diesel and wet leaves. I drove my old SUV down the gravel road until I couldn't go any farther, then parked it near a small clearing where the trail began. From there, I hauled my gear on a cheap sled I'd strapped with bungee cords. It took me about an hour and a half to reach the cabin. The trail twisted and dipped and climbed again through thick pine and birch, mostly dry leaves crunching underfoot. The forest was quiet except for birds and the occasional squirrel. No people, no aircraft overhead. Couldn't even hear the wind. It was like the trees just swallowed every bit of noise and held it there. When I finally saw the roof line of the cabin through the branches, it felt like walking into another time. It was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet, with a steep roof and thick logs sealed with some kind of dark caulk. The door had a padlock, which I opened with the key. The inside smelled like pine and dust. A small cot with thick wool blankets sat in the corner. There was a wood stove in the center, a little table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some old books and candles, and a few cast iron pans hanging on the wall. I unpacked and started settling in. First thing I did was check the solar battery. It was almost full, which meant the little solar panel mounted to the roof still worked. I plugged in the radio and heard static, which was normal for that deep in the woods. The generator I left outside near the shed, in case I needed it. I brought in wood stacked outside and filled the stove, then lit it. The warmth spread quickly. Felt like I'd stepped into another life. The first 3 days were quiet. I spent the mornings chopping wood and cleaning up the area around the cabin. There were animal prints around, deer, raccoons, some smaller tracks I didn't recognize, but nothing that worried me. I hiked a bit, stayed on the trail, and made sure I always kept track of how far I was from the cabin. In the afternoons, I read or napped or sat on the small bench out front and listened to the forest. I didn't feel bored. I felt like I was finally letting my brain rest. On the 4th night, something woke me. I couldn't tell what time it was, but it was fully dark outside. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting faint red shadows on the floor and walls. First, I thought I'd dreamed something, but then I heard it again, something brushing against the side of the cabin. It wasn't a branch. It was lower, softer, like fabric against wood or fingers dragging along the wall. I sat up on the cot, heart kicking up a notch. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it again, just a faint sound, then a soft crunch, like a footstep in dry leaves. I got up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. I couldn't see anything. No lights, no movement, just trees and darkness. I stood there for a while, straining to hear. Then I closed the curtain and added more wood to the stove. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer brushing against the side of the cabin, maybe a porcupine. The woods were full of things that moved around at night. I tried to believe that, The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I found faint boot prints in the leaves. Definitely human. They weren't mine. I knew where I'd walked. These came from behind the shed and stopped just outside the back wall of the cabin. No sign of a campfire or tent. Just footprints, maybe 6 or 7 steps, and then they vanished into the woods. My stomach sank. This deep into the forest, nobody should have been back here unless they knew about the cabin. I didn't see anything else. No litter, no markings, just those prints. That day, I kept close to the cabin. I chopped wood but kept glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't hear or see anyone. Still, I felt something shift. That deep peace I'd felt before had started to erode. I wasn't sure if I was being watched, but it felt like it. I stopped walking far from the cabin. I kept the axe inside. I made sure the padlock was latched every night. That night, it was quiet again. No footsteps, no brushing sounds. I still couldn't sleep. On the 6th day, I found something that made my stomach twist. A rabbit carcass had been hung by its back legs from a branch about 5 feet off the ground just 20 yards behind the shed. Its throat had been cut cleanly, and the blood had dripped into a neat pool under the tree. I hadn't heard anything the night before. No cries, no struggle, just silence. I didn't touch it. I didn't go near it. I walked back to the cabin and locked the door. I didn't go out the rest of the day. I sat near the stove with the axe across my knees and tried to keep calm. I started thinking about leaving early, but it was a long walk back to the SUV, and I didn't like the idea of hauling my gear alone through the woods with someone else possibly out there. I didn't want to leave in the dark. I waited one more night. Nothing happened. The next morning, I packed everything. I took only what I needed and left the rest behind. It had snowed lightly during the night, so I could clearly see if anyone had walked near the cabin. There were no new tracks. I started down the trail around mid-morning. It was cold but clear. My breath fogged in front of me as I hauled the sled. The trail curved and dipped, and the trees pressed close. About halfway back to the SUV, I noticed something that made me stop. In the snow, alongside my own trail from the day before, was another set of prints. They followed mine exactly, step for step. Whoever made them hadn't tried to hide it. They weren't even careful. I didn't know how long they'd been there. Maybe during the night, maybe earlier. I kept walking faster now. I didn't stop again until I reached the SUV. I threw the gear into the back, didn't even bother strapping it properly, and got in. My hands were shaking when I turned the key. The engine fired up, and I drove out of there without looking back. I didn't report anything. I didn't know who I'd even tell. There wasn't a crime, not really, but something about that whole experience stuck with me. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night. Whoever was out there hadn't tried to talk to me, hadn't tried to steal anything. They just followed me, watched me, left signs like they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. After I got home, I called the number I'd used to book the cabin. It was disconnected. I tried to check the website, but it had vanished. The listing was gone. The whole site was down. I didn't try too hard to track it down. Part of me didn't want to know more. That trip changed how I feel about being alone. I used to think solitude was peace. Now I know it's not always that. Sometimes, when you think you're alone, someone's watching. Not ghosts, not monsters, just someone real and breathing who chooses not to be seen. And that's what scared me the most. I've never gone back to the woods since. I was 34 the year I decided to take a solo trip up to a remote cabin near Iron River, Michigan. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just finished a long stretch of project work for a landscaping company I co-owned with a buddy from college. Business was good, but the last 6 months had been a constant grind. Early mornings, weekend jobs, endless paperwork. I felt drained and unmotivated. I needed something to break the routine, something quiet and far away from the noise of work, phones, and responsibilities. I found the cabin through a listing on a small Midwestern rental site. It was owned by a retired couple who had moved to Florida and were barely using it anymore. It sat on about 25 acres of forest, with a gravel road leading a few miles in from the main highway. It had no internet, no TV, and no cell service. Just a generator, a wood stove, a propane tank, and a small dock that jutted out onto a quiet lake. No neighbors, no traffic, no sounds except whatever the woods decided to offer. That was exactly what I wanted. I left on a Wednesday morning, packed my truck with 5 days worth of food, clothes, firewood, and some tools just in case something broke. It was an 8-hour drive from where I lived in southern Wisconsin. I rolled in just after 6 p.m., with the sun still hanging in the sky and the smell of pine heavy in the air. The gravel driveway curved up and around a small hill before leveling out in front of the cabin. It was a simple A-frame with dark brown siding and a green tin roof. A small porch looked out over the lake. There was a detached shed nearby, with a couple of old canoes leaned up against it and a stack of firewood under a tarp. I got the generator going, unpacked what I needed, and spent the first evening just settling in. I cooked a simple meal on the propane stove, sat on the porch, and watched the water. The lake was dead calm, glassy, and still. Somewhere across the water, a loon called out. That night, I fell asleep hard and fast in the little bedroom tucked up in the loft, the window open to the warm summer air. The second day was quiet, just like I wanted. I walked the trails that looped around the cabin's property, following deer paths and old logging roads. I saw fresh tracks, deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote, but nothing else. No people, no movement. I didn't even see a plane overhead. It was like the world outside had gone quiet. I cooked eggs and bacon in the morning, sandwiches for lunch, and pasta in the evening. I read a paperback I had brought, wrote in a small journal I kept, and watched the water again as the sun went down. Still no ripples, no boats, just silence. It was on the third day that I noticed something a little off. I was out early, just after breakfast. The air was cool, the kind of chill that clings to the trees before the sun gets high enough to burn it off. I decided to take a longer walk, deeper into the woods than before. I followed a narrow game trail down through a small ravine and then up the other side, moving slow to avoid tripping on roots and rocks. I hadn't seen any signs of human activity so far. No rappers, no old campsites, not even tree markings. But that morning, I saw something strange just off the path. It was a single boot, a muddy, faded tan work boot, sitting upright, half tucked beneath some undergrowth. It wasn't rotten or falling apart, but it didn't look new either. The laces were missing. It looked like it had been there a while. At first, I figured it had been lost by a hunter or logger years ago. But then I realized it was facing directly toward the trail, like someone had stepped out of it mid-walk and left it there. I picked it up. It was heavy, soaked at the bottom, but no obvious tears or damage. No animal bites, no chewed up leather, just abandoned. I carried it for a bit, unsure what to do with it, then left it on a flat rock so it wouldn't get swallowed by the woods again. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the boot, about how there hadn't been a matching one nearby. No bones, no scraps of clothing, just that one, left in a place that didn't feel right. I told myself not to dwell on it. Maybe someone had dropped it from a pack, maybe it was left behind years ago and the forest had just pushed the other one under, but something about it sat heavy in my mind. I woke up twice that night, once around midnight, then again closer to 3. The second time, I thought I heard something outside the cabin. A soft crunching sound, like leaves being stepped on. But it was faint, and by the time I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing, just trees and moonlight. I chalked it up to a raccoon or a deer passing by. The next morning, I walked back to where I had found the boot. It was gone. The rock was still there. I recognized the shape, the moss on the side, even the weird crack running across it. But the boot I had left sitting on top was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, checked the bushes, walked a little up and down the trail. Nothing. No sign of it. The ground didn't look disturbed. No drag marks, no prints. It was just gone, like I had never touched it. That day, I didn't hike as far. I stayed closer to the cabin, kept busy chopping wood and stacking it even though I already had plenty. I cleaned the porch, checked the shed, rechecked the generator. Anything to stay active, but my brain kept spinning. By sunset, I was watching the tree line across the lake. Not the water, not the sky, just the shadows moving between the trees. I started noticing patterns in the bark. Lines that didn't look natural, cracks that looked too even. I told myself I was just overthinking, that I needed rest. That night, I brought one of the axes inside. I had no reason. Nothing had happened, but I didn't like how it felt. The silence had turned from peaceful to heavy, like the air was watching me, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I locked the door, even though the nearest person was probably miles away. I didn't sleep much. Around 2:30, I heard something again. It was louder this time. Footsteps, clearly, slow, deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves just beyond the front porch. Then a pause, then another step, then nothing. I didn't move. I just sat up in bed, heart racing, barely breathing. I kept my eyes on the dark loft window. It was still open from earlier in the day, and I wondered if anything could climb up the roof and reach it. The generator had gone off hours ago, so the only light was from the moon. I didn't hear anything else that night. When morning finally came, I forced myself to go outside. I checked the ground around the porch. There were no clear prints, just soft indentations that could have been from anything. The kind of half-shapes leaves make when they shift overnight. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I had heard. I should have packed up then. I should have left. But I stayed. Told myself it was probably a deer, that the boot had just slipped off the rock and rolled away, that I was tired, not thinking clearly. I didn't want to look like a coward, not even to myself. I had told everyone I was going out to reset, to be alone in nature. Leaving early felt like quitting, like failure. That day, I didn't go into the woods at all. I stayed close, sat on the porch with the axe next to me. I didn't read. I didn't write. I just watched and listened. Around noon, I noticed something strange on the dock. There were scratches in the wood, shallow, maybe a few inches long, and spaced out unevenly. They hadn't been there before. I had walked down there 2 days earlier barefoot, and I would have seen or felt them. They were fresh, splintered around the edges, like someone had dragged something sharp across the planks. But they didn't go anywhere. Just a patch, maybe 2 feet wide, then nothing. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair downstairs, near the window that faced the woods. I kept the lights off, listened, watched. The axe stayed in my lap. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Not on the porch this time. Off to the right, in the woods beyond the shed. Soft, slow steps, then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Then a sharp tap on the far wall of the cabin. Just one. I didn't move. Another tap. Then footsteps. Then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, unmoving, barely breathing. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my things. Fast. I didn't eat. Didn't clean. I threw everything into the truck, fired up the engine, and got the hell out. I didn't look back. I drove the full 8 hours without stopping more than once for gas. I didn't start to feel normal again until I hit the highway and saw other cars. A few weeks later, I called the owners to ask if anyone else had ever reported weird things out there. They said no. Said most people loved the quiet, the solitude. They asked if something was wrong. I lied. Said I just didn't sleep well up there. I didn't want to explain, but I knew what I had heard. I knew that boot hadn't walked off by itself. I knew those footsteps weren't in my head. Something or someone was out there. Not a ghost. Not some storybook monster. Just something real. Flesh and It was October 2019 when I finally decided to take a break from everything. I just turned 34. My job at a construction firm in Cincinnati had been eating up every part of my day for months. Long hours, constant travel, always on call. I hadn't really slept properly in weeks. My back ached from standing too long. My head was always full of noise. I needed silence. No phones, no city, no one around. Just stillness. So I rented a cabin. Nothing fancy. Just a single-bedroom wooden place about 40 minutes outside of Roanoke, Virginia. tucked into the edge of Jefferson National Forest. The listing said it had been used mostly by hunters in the off-season, so it wasn't updated or stylish. I didn't care. I wanted something old, quiet, with no Wi-Fi. The fewer distractions, the better. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, packed light. I had a few days' worth of food, some instant coffee, and my hiking boots. I brought a portable battery for emergencies, a flashlight, and a small hatchet. I planned to just sit there, maybe walk in the woods, clear my head, and sleep in. When I got to the cabin, it was exactly what I wanted. It sat back from the road, off a small gravel trail that looked like it hadn't been used much. The trees around it were tall and thick. The leaves had turned already, mostly gold and deep red, and the whole forest floor looked like it had a fire-colored carpet laid over it. The cabin itself was maybe 25 feet wide, built from rough logs, with a tin roof and a tiny porch with a single wooden chair. No neighbors, no signs of other cabins, just trees and silence. Inside, the air smelled faintly like old pine and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a small wood stove in the corner with a pile of chopped logs beside it, a cot with a thin mattress, and an old table with two mismatched chairs. The windows were small and had no screens. I checked the cupboards. A few old cans, mostly empty. A mouse had chewed through one box of crackers. I threw it out. There was no running water, only a hand pump out back. The outhouse was about 20 feet into the trees, leaning a little but solid. I settled in quickly. I didn't plan to do much anyway. That first night, I just unpacked, made a fire in the stove, and ate some crackers and canned chili. I remember how quiet it was. Not just the absence of noise, but a kind of stillness that made you notice things you usually ignore, like the sound of the wind brushing against dry leaves, or a branch cracking somewhere far off. It wasn't creepy, not yet. It was peaceful. I sat outside for a while after dark, just staring up through the branches at the stars. It was the next morning that I noticed something odd. I woke up at around 7. I'd left the stove burning low through the night, just to keep the chill off. I stepped outside to use the outhouse and take a piss, and I noticed prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I'd worn boots with a deep tread. These were flat, shallow prints, like sneakers or soft-soled shoes, and they weren't fresh, maybe made the evening before or earlier that morning. But they were there. I could see the shape of the heel, even a faint toe line in the soft dirt by the porch. They circled around the cabin. One set went up to the side window, then turned back. Another set came up from the woods behind the outhouse. I stood there for a while, just staring at the ground. There wasn't any sign of dragging or damage, and the door was still locked from the inside. I told myself it was probably nothing. Could have been an old trail. Could have been mine from the night before and I just didn't remember. But I knew that wasn't right. I kept thinking about it all morning. I made some instant coffee, sat outside on the porch and tried to shake it off. But I couldn't. It was too strange. Who would walk around out here? There were no other cabins nearby. The gravel road was a dead end. I decided to walk the perimeter just to see. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet, mostly for comfort, and went about 100 feet into the woods in each direction. I didn't see any fresh campsites, no trash, no signs of anyone, just trees. By mid-afternoon, I was back at the cabin. I closed the shutters on the side windows and made sure the door was locked. I checked it twice. That night, I kept the fire going a little higher than before. I sat in bed with my flashlight close by, listening. The wind picked up around 10. The leaves scraped against the window panes, and I thought I heard something walking outside around 11, but it might have just been a raccoon. At one point, just before midnight, I got up and looked through the window. I didn't see anything, just the edge of the woods, dark and silent. I tried to sleep, but only drifted off sometime after 1. When I woke up, the first thing I did was go outside and check the ground. There were more prints. These were fresher. The tread was clearer, more defined. They were closer to the front door now, and one set had gone around the side to the back window again. Something about the way the prints moved made my stomach turn. It wasn't just someone passing through. It looked like someone was checking the place out, circling it, watching. I didn't eat breakfast. I felt sick. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to Cincinnati. But I felt like if I left now, without knowing who had been out there, it would stay in my head forever. I needed to be sure, so I made a plan. That afternoon, I cleared out a spot in the firewood pile near the porch and tucked my phone, with the flashlight camera on, behind one of the logs, facing the cabin. I angled it low, pointing toward the path that led from the woods to the side window. I pressed record and left it running. I had the battery pack hooked up so it would last at least 12 hours. Then I waited. I didn't light the stove that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I stayed quiet in the dark, crouched behind the edge of the cot with my flashlight off. I left the window cracked just enough to hear better. Hours passed. It was almost 2 a.m. when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate ones. Not an animal. Not the wind. The sound of soft shoes pressing down on dry leaves and loose dirt. They came from the trees, then moved to the porch. I held my breath. The floorboard creaked. One loud pop, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't dare. My hand was around the handle of the hatchet, but my fingers were wet with sweat. I was waiting for a knock, a bang, something, but nothing happened. After what felt like an hour, the sound moved again. The steps circled the cabin. I could hear them brushing against the wall just outside. Then nothing. I stayed still until morning. As soon as the light came through the cracks in the shutter, I stood and grabbed my phone from the pile. My hand shook as I stopped the recording. I watched the footage. At exactly 1:56 a.m., a figure stepped into frame. Male, maybe late 30s, tall, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He didn't look toward the camera. He walked up to the porch, paused, and leaned against the post like he was listening. Then he walked slowly around the side of the cabin, out of view. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. Just stood there, then left. I packed my things right then. I stuffed everything into the duffel, didn't even fold the blanket. I just threw it in. I didn't eat, didn't shower. I left the cabin exactly as it was and got in my car. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I looked back once. Nothing behind me, but that didn't matter. I drove back to the main road and didn't stop until I hit the first gas station 2 towns away. There, I sat in the lot and played the video again. The part that hit me hardest wasn't the man standing there. It was that, earlier in the video, around 11:13 p.m., I saw a faint flicker of light in the background, between the trees, like a flashlight moving deeper into the woods, which meant the guy I saw wasn't alone. Someone else had been there too, watching from farther away. I went to the local sheriff's office. I showed them the footage. They took my statement, but I could tell they weren't surprised. The deputy said sometimes squatters or vagrants pass through those woods. Sometimes, people use the forest for things they don't want others to see. They sent someone to check the cabin out later that day. I never heard if they found anything. I never went back. I didn't sleep properly for weeks after that. I kept thinking about how long they might have been watching. Whether they'd been there the first night too, standing just out of view, watching through the window, and the way he walked up to the porch like he already knew I was inside. Now, years later, I still remember the way the dirt looked that second morning. The prints all facing the windows, all facing me. I thought I was going to that cabin to get away from people, but people were exactly what I should have been afraid of. It was the fall of 2017, and I was 35 at the time. I'd been working nonstop for nearly 10 years at a small construction company in Cincinnati, Ohio. Between deadlines, clients, and trying to keep up with bills, I was worn out. I had some saved up vacation days, and I finally decided to use them. I wanted to get away from everything. No phones, no noise, just quiet. One of my coworkers, Josh, had mentioned a small cabin his uncle owned out near St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. Said it was old, a little rough, but quiet and remote. Sounded perfect. I called his uncle, wired him a few $100 for the week, and packed up my old gray Chevy Silverado. I brought with me enough groceries to last the whole trip. Canned goods, rice, pasta, jerky, a big jug of drinking water, and a few 6-packs of beer. I threw in a sleeping bag, a small toolkit, and my camping gear just in case. The drive took about 6 hours, through smaller and smaller towns, past cornfields and long stretches of road that barely had a shoulder. When I got there, the cabin looked like it hadn't been used in a while. It sat at the edge of a patch of woods, maybe 100 feet back from a narrow dirt road. The yard was overgrown with grass and scattered branches. The cabin itself was made of dark wood that had grayed over time. One small window in front and a thin, rusty chimney sticking out from the roof. I had to push the front door hard to get it open. It scraped against the uneven floor, and it smelled like wood and dust inside, like an attic that hadn't been opened in years. The cabin was small, just one room and a tiny bathroom added on in the back. There was a little kitchen counter with a sink that didn't work and a propane burner sitting on top. A cot with a lumpy mattress sat against one wall, and a wood stove was tucked into the corner. I didn't mind. It was exactly what I needed. The first day was uneventful. I spent time unpacking, chopping some firewood from a stack out back, and getting a small fire going. I ate cold beans and crackers for dinner and sat outside as the sun went down. The sky turned orange and purple behind the trees, and the air got cold fast. By nightfall, I was already in my sleeping bag on the cot, listening to the wind pushing through the trees. That night, I had a hard time sleeping. I'd expected the quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than I was used to. Not peaceful exactly. Every tiny sound felt louder than it should have been. Cracking branches, leaves skittering across the roof, small thumps from the woods. It's strange how silence can make your mind start pulling out shapes in the dark. At some point, I passed out from exhaustion. The second day, I tried to settle in more. I hiked a little bit behind the cabin, where the trees were thick but walkable. I found a shallow stream maybe a quarter mile in and filled up a small collapsible bucket for washing dishes. When I got back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A deep scratch on the wooden door, about waist high. It looked like something had dug into it. I brushed it off, figuring it was from a raccoon or a deer scraping past. Later that afternoon, I spotted some tire tracks in the dirt near the entrance. I hadn't noticed them the day before. They were faint, but they looked fresh, maybe from that morning. I hadn't heard another car. The nearest house was at least a few miles down the road, and I hadn't seen another person since I got there. Still, I didn't think too much of it. Could have been someone checking hunting traps or just driving by. That night, it got colder. The firewood burned faster than I expected, and I had to step outside in the dark to grab more from the pile. When I opened the door, something felt wrong. The woods looked the same, but I got this weird feeling like I was being watched. It wasn't a sound or a shadow, just that creeping feeling on the back of your neck. I grabbed the wood and hurried back inside, bolting the door behind me. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a thud. It wasn't a tree branch or an animal on the roof. It was sharp and heavy, like something hit the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing else came. I waited, staring at the window. I couldn't see anything through the glass, just my own reflection in the dark. I stayed like that until the sun came up. When morning finally came, I went outside to check. There was a dent in the side of the cabin. Not a hole, just a deep push-in of the wood like something had struck it hard. I looked around the ground, no rocks, no logs, no sign of what did it, just the dent. That day I spent with a weird knot in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I didn't have cell service out there, and I hadn't brought a radio or anything to check the news. I decided I'd just stick it out and leave a day early if I needed to. I spent the afternoon patching the dented wall with a piece of flat metal I found in the tool shed out back, screwing it into place to keep out the cold. Then I cooked some canned soup and tried to relax, even had a couple beers to settle down. That night, I kept a hatchet by my bed. I barely slept. Every time I started drifting off, a noise would jolt me back awake. At one point, I heard soft crunching outside, like footsteps moving slowly through the leaves. I held my breath and waited. The steps stopped, then started again closer to the window. I didn't move. Eventually, the sound faded. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I was done pretending it was nothing. I packed up most of my gear and decided I'd leave the next day instead of sticking out the full week. I was outside around midday, loading a few things into the truck when I saw it. Down the dirt road, maybe 50 yards out, there was a man standing just beyond the trees. I don't know how long he'd been there. He was still not moving. I couldn't see his face, just that he was wearing a dark jacket and jeans. I looked down for half a second, literally just to grab my keys, and when I looked back up, he was gone. I ran down the road to where he'd been, shouting out just in case he needed help or was lost. But there was no sign of him. No footprints, no movement, nothing. It was like he'd just vanished into the trees. I walked back to the cabin and locked myself in for the rest of the day. That night was the worst. I kept every light I had on. I didn't sleep at all, just sat in the chair by the window watching. Around midnight, I heard scratching again, on the back wall this time. Slow, steady scraping. I turned off the inside light and moved to the back window, but I couldn't see anything. The scraping stopped, then started again from the other side of the cabin. I went to the front door and stood there, listening, not breathing. Then came a knock. Not loud, just a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. I backed away from the door. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it was shaking my chest. I didn't make a sound. I waited there, holding the hatchet tight. Nothing else came. No more knocks, no footsteps, no scratching. Stayed quiet after that. I sat there, awake, waiting for daylight. As soon as the sky started turning gray, I grabbed the last of my stuff, threw it into the truck, and got out. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe easy until I hit the main road and had bars on my phone again. When I got back to Cincinnati, I tried to explain what happened to a couple of people, but I didn't have any real proof. Just a few marks on the cabin and my own nerves. They all shrugged it off as paranoia, maybe a hunter or local messing around. A week later, I decided to call Josh's uncle to let him know something strange might have happened up there. His wife answered. She told me her husband had passed away 2 months earlier. Stroke. No one had been using or watching the cabin since then. The number I'd used to call and send the payment wasn't hers. She didn't even know it had been rented. I checked my bank records. The transfer had gone through to a private name I didn't recognize, not to Josh's uncle. I never figured out who I had spoken to or who I paid. Josh couldn't explain it either. He just assumed I'd gotten in touch with someone from the family. I tried to forget about it. Months passed. Then one day, while cleaning out a box of stuff from the trip, I found something I didn't remember packing. A piece of twine, wrapped in a loop and tied in a way I'd never seen before. It was shoved into a side pocket of my backpack. I hadn't seen it before, hadn't put it there. To this day, I don't know what happened out there, but I know it wasn't just animals or the wind or an overactive imagination. Something was wrong about that cabin. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I haven't been back to the woods since. I was 29 years old when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. It was late October, the year 1997. The trees around me had already lost most of their leaves, and the chill in the air felt sharp, biting through my jacket every time I stepped outside. I'd been feeling restless, tired of the city noise and endless rush. I wanted silence, isolation, and the kind of solitude that only a place like that could offer. The cabin was a modest structure, built sometime in the late 50s, made of weathered logs with a simple tin roof. It stood on a small clearing surrounded by thick pines and maples, near a narrow dirt road that most people probably didn't even know existed. The drive out there was long and lonely. The trees lined the road like tall sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the cold wind. The sun was dipping low by the time I reached the cabin, casting a dull orange glow across the landscape. There was no cell service, no internet, and barely any electricity, just a single generator that powered a few lights inside. The previous owner had left behind some basic supplies: a small stack of firewood, canned food, a manual water pump, and a rusted old propane stove. No one else was nearby for miles. The first night was calm. I built a fire in the stone hearth, the flames crackling loudly in the quiet room. I ate some canned beans and sat staring into the firelight, feeling the peacefulness settle over me. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere far off, an owl called out. I felt strangely comforted by the sounds of the forest, even if they were unfamiliar. The next morning, I woke early, pulled on my boots, and decided to explore the surrounding woods. The ground was damp from recent rain, and the smell of wet leaves and pine needles filled the air. The trees were tall and close together, the sunlight barely breaking through the thick canopy. I followed a narrow trail that led downhill toward a small stream. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. I knelt to splash some on my face, feeling the cold bite into my skin. For a moment, the only sounds were the gentle rush of water and the soft rustling of leaves. As I wandered further, I noticed how quiet the forest was compared to the city. No cars, no people, just the occasional bird or squirrel moving through the underbrush. It felt like the world had been paused here, waiting for something. I found a few fallen logs and sat down, resting and listening. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and thick, like a living thing. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin to check the generator. It was old and finicky, but with a bit of coaxing, it hummed to life, lighting up the small bulbs overhead. I heated some water on the stove for coffee and settled into a chair by the window. The view outside was breathtaking. An endless sea of trees stretching toward the horizon, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But beneath that beauty was a strange feeling, one I couldn't quite place. A sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Over the next few days, I fell into a routine. I chopped wood, fetched water from the pump, cooked simple meals, and spent hours reading or walking in the woods. Each night, I'd light a fire in the hearth, sit quietly, and watch the flames dance. The isolation was exactly what I wanted, and yet, every so often, a strange unease would creep over me. Started small. I'd hear a twig snap far off in the woods, or catch a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. Sometimes, I'd look out the window and think I saw a figure standing between the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and shadows. The forest was full of life after all. Deer, foxes, maybe a bear or two. It was natural to see movement. But then things began to feel more deliberate. One morning, I found the front door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd locked it the night before. No signs of forced entry, no footprints around the cabin. I checked inside carefully. Nothing seemed missing or disturbed. Still, my heart raced. I locked the door again, triple-checked the windows, and felt the weight of eyes on me. That afternoon, while chopping wood at the back of the cabin, I heard footsteps behind me, crunching on dry leaves. I spun around, axe raised, but there was nothing there, just the empty forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt stupid. Who was out there? Why would anyone come here? No one knew I was here. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin. I sat close to the fire, watching the shadows grow and shrink. At one point, I thought I heard whispering voices, soft and distant, but when I strained to listen, they stopped. I kept telling myself it was the wind or animals, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The following days were tense. Every sound made me jump. I found more signs someone had been nearby. Broken twigs on the path, disturbed leaves, a shallow hole dug near the side of the cabin. The water pump handle was loose when I returned to it, though I was certain I'd left it tight. No footprints again, no clear evidence of who or what had been there. I thought about leaving, but something held me back. I wanted to prove I could handle the isolation, that I wasn't afraid. So I stayed. One afternoon, I decided to explore farther than before. I packed a small bag with water, a knife, and a flashlight. I followed a faint trail that led deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and the underbrush harder to push through. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched between the trunks. I kept thinking about the strange things that had happened, wondering if I might run into whoever or whatever was out there. After an hour of walking, I reached a small clearing with an old, rusted car half buried in leaves and dirt. The windows were shattered, and the paint peeled off in chunks. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I looked around, searching for any clues. Nearby, a broken chain link fence hung loosely from bent posts. It seemed like this place had once been part of a property, long forgotten. I crouched to examine the ground and found fresh footprints in the soft soil. They were human, too large to be mine, and they led away from the clearing toward a denser part of the forest. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Whoever had been here recently wasn't far away. I debated whether to follow the tracks, but the light was fading fast. I decided to turn back. As I walked, I heard a faint rustling behind me, like someone moving quickly through the underbrush. My heart pounded, and I picked up my pace, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the cabin, the door was wide open. Panic surged through me as I rushed inside. The place was in disarray. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, things scattered on the floor. Someone had been inside, searching for something. I grabbed the axe from where I'd left it by the door and stood ready. I called out, but no answer came. The forest outside was silent, as if holding its breath. I checked every room carefully, but there was no one there. The back door was open too, swinging on its hinges in the wind. Whoever had come here was gone. I locked all the doors and windows again, piling furniture in front of them for extra protection. I sat by the fire, gripping the axe, waiting for dawn. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. Whatever was out there had been watching me, following me, invading my space. I packed quickly, taking only the essentials, and locked the cabin as best I could. On the drive back down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something trailing behind. But the forest was empty, quiet, peaceful again. When I reached the nearest town, I reported what had happened to the local sheriff. He listened carefully, then told me that there had been reports of a man living off the grid somewhere in those woods. Someone who didn't want to be found, and who wasn't afraid to scare people away. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't need to. The woods had shown me their secret, and I understood that some places are better left alone. The peace I had sought was not for me to find there, not when danger lurked just beyond the trees. But I learned something important that week. Fear isn't always about what you see or hear. Sometimes it's about knowing that you're not alone, that someone or something is watching, waiting, and that you are vulnerable. That feeling stayed with me long after I left the cabin behind. Years later, when I tell the story, I don't mention ghosts or monsters. There were none, just a person, hiding in the woods, and a reminder that even in the most beautiful, peaceful places, danger can be real and very human. I spent the first half of 2023 working long shifts at a small auto repair shop in Salt Lake City. By the end of October, I was burned out. The shop had been slammed all summer, and between the heat, the noise, and being around people every day, I needed a break. I wasn't interested in flying anywhere or seeing cities or crowds. I just wanted silence and space. So I booked a small cabin deep in the Wasatch National Forest. 2 hours out, high up in the mountains, no neighbors, no cell service, just a wood stove and a small generator for basic power. I left early on a Friday morning in mid-November. The weather had just started to turn cold, but the roads were still clear. I drove my old 2007 Chevy Silverado, loaded with firewood, water, canned food, and enough gear to last me over a week. I wasn't planning anything ambitious, just rest, short hikes, maybe a little reading. I didn't even bring a laptop. The cabin was small, older but solid, maybe built in the 60s or 70s. It had a single bedroom, a wood-paneled kitchen, and a tiny living room with a cast iron stove. There was a stack of firewood already out back and a backup propane heater inside in case things got too cold. The nearest ranger station was more than 10 miles away. The last paved road ended 5 miles before the cabin. So once I got off the main road, I was on dirt and gravel. The last 2 miles were especially rough, steep, rutted, and barely wide enough for my truck. I got there just before sunset. The air was thin and cold, the way it gets above 7,000 feet. The silence was deep, I didn't hear a single bird or branch snap, just wind through the trees and the occasional creak of my truck settling. I brought everything inside, locked up, and started the stove. I kept the generator off most of the time to save gas, only running it for maybe 30 minutes at night to charge a battery pack and turn on the main lights while I cooked. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I took short hikes during the day, stayed near the property lines, made fires in the evening, and just listened to the wind. It was one of the few times in years I'd felt completely still. No pressure, no deadlines, no noise. On the fourth night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something tapping on the side of the cabin. I figured it was a branch, maybe a loose shutter. It wasn't loud, just soft and irregular. Tap, 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 then silence. I lay there for a minute listening, thinking the wind had probably shifted. I wasn't scared, just annoyed. But when I got up in the morning and checked outside, nothing looked different. No new branches down, nothing leaning on the siding. The ground was soft from frost, but I didn't see any tracks or signs of animals. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, chopping extra wood and moving it inside just in case the weather turned. I tried not to let the tapping bother me. Cabins creak, trees sway. Still, I kept looking out the window more than usual. That night, I made sure all the windows were locked. I ran the generator just long enough to charge my phone and turn on the main light while I cooked some pasta. Then I turned it off and sat with a lantern near the stove. I remember listening to the fire crack and the wind roll over the roof. Around 2:45 a.m., the tapping came again. This time, it was from the back wall, the side that faced the dense woods and had no windows. It was slow and steady. Tap, 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 pause. Then again. I held my breath and waited to hear it again. It wasn't wood shifting or a branch scraping in the wind. It was too deliberate, like knuckles or metal. I got out of bed and stood in the middle of the room, listening. My heart was pounding harder than I wanted to admit. I reached for the small hatchet I'd kept near the door, more for splitting kindling than anything else. The tapping stopped. The next morning, I walked around the entire cabin. Still no tracks, no damage, nothing on the siding. I walked about 50 yards into the trees behind the cabin to see if maybe something had fallen. Nothing. No branches, no broken limbs. But I did notice something else. The brush back there was crushed down. Not trampled like by hooves or paws, just pushed over. Flattened in a way that suggested someone or something had stood there for a while. I thought maybe a deer had bedded down. But there weren't the usual signs, no droppings, no hoof marks. That afternoon, I debated leaving early. I had 4 days left on the rental, but I was starting to feel watched. Still, I didn't want to spook myself over something that could have just been wind. I told myself I was imagining the pressure. I reminded myself why I came, to get away, to clear my head, to not run at the first strange noise. I stayed inside the rest of the day and barely touched the generator. I read by lantern and made sure everything was locked again. I kept the hatchet next to the couch. At 3:11 a.m., I remember the exact time because I just looked at my watch. I heard the doorknob rattle. Not hard, just a quick twist. A pause, then a second try. I didn't move. I just stared at the door. I hadn't run the generator, so the only light inside was from the dying fire. Everything was shadows and faint outlines. The knob stopped. Then something brushed against the wooden wall to the right of the door, soft like a hand dragging slowly along it. The tapping started again, this time on the side of the window above the sink. Then it stopped. Then again on the opposite wall. It was moving around the cabin. Slow. Testing. I stayed up until dawn, frozen, listening. When the light finally came through the trees, I threw open the door and walked the full perimeter. There were faint marks in the dirt. A few irregular depressions, not clearly shaped, but not animal either. Like someone walking barefoot or in socks. No shoe tread, just patches of flattened leaves and dirt. That morning, I packed up half my gear and loaded it into the truck. I kept the engine off and sat in the driver's seat for a long time. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to feel chased out of the one place I'd come to clear my head. But something was wrong. I could feel it in my chest. I told myself I'd leave the next morning if anything else happened that night. That night, I didn't light the stove. I didn't cook. I just kept my coat on, sat in the dark, and waited. It was completely silent. For hours. Then, around 1:30 a.m., I saw a shape through the front window. No light, no sound, just a silhouette standing still, barely visible against the faint starlight reflecting off the snow-dusted ground. Not close, maybe 30 feet away. It didn't move. I crouched low and stayed against the wall. My breathing felt too loud. Every creak in the cabin made me jump. When I finally looked again, maybe 20 minutes later, the shape was gone. But on the porch, I saw a single dark smudge. I waited until daylight again before I opened the door. There, on the top step of the porch, was a single muddy footprint. Barefoot, adult-sized, no tread, just heel, ball, and toes. I didn't care how long I had left on the rental. I loaded the rest of my stuff into the truck in under 10 minutes, started the engine, and got the hell out of there. The road was rough, and I could hear things shifting in the truck bed the whole way down. But I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the highway and didn't slow down until I was nearly back in Salt Lake. Back home, I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe it was a squatter, a hunter who got lost and didn't say anything. Maybe someone thought the cabin was empty. But if that were true, why didn't they knock? Why did they come back night after night, just testing the walls, circling, never saying a word? I told the cabin owner when I got back. She seemed surprised but didn't offer much. Just said no one had ever complained before. I didn't push it. I just wanted to forget it. It's been 6 months since then. I still think about that cabin sometimes. The silence, the trees, the way the tapping always came around the same time. I haven't gone back. I haven't gone camping since either. And now, before I go anywhere remote, I check more than just the reviews. I check the news, police reports, missing persons. Because I know what I felt out there. Someone was watching that cabin. And they weren't passing through. They were waiting, testing, choosing. And I think I left just in time. I was 28 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. It was early October, 2019, the time when the trees are painted in reds, yellows, and oranges, the air crisp and sharp, and the nights falling quickly after the sun dipped behind the hills. I wanted to get away from everything. My job, the city noise, the constant messages and emails. Just me and the woods. I thought it would be peaceful, quiet. A chance to clear my head. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was old, built sometime in the 1950s, maybe earlier by the looks of it. 2 rooms, one big room that served as the kitchen and living area, with a small wood stove for heat, and a bedroom with a single bed and a tiny bathroom with a sink and an old-fashioned shower. No running water for drinking or cooking. I had brought all my water in jugs. No electricity except for a small solar panel hooked up to a battery for some light. No internet, no phone signal. It was perfect for what I wanted. When I arrived late afternoon, the sun was already low. I parked my small rental car on the rough dirt driveway, kicking up dust as I opened the door and stepped out. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. The trees were tall, mostly maple and birch, their leaves rustling softly in the light breeze. The ground was covered with dry leaves that crunched underfoot. The cabin stood quiet and a little worn, its wood faded gray and rough with age. I carried my bags inside, lit a small fire in the stove to warm up the place, and unpacked my supplies. Food, clothes, books, and a small radio that worked on batteries. I wasn't planning to use it much, but I wanted some kind of connection, just in case. The first night was quiet, except for the usual sounds of the forest. Birds settling down, the rustle of animals moving in the underbrush, the creak of branches in the wind. On the second day, I spent time gathering firewood. The dry branches snapped easily, and the wood smelled fresh and piney. I stacked it neatly by the cabin door. I explored the small area around the cabin, noticing a small stream about 100 meters away, its water clear and cold. I filled a bottle and drank some. It tasted fresh but carried the faint taste of earth and moss. I liked the silence, the kind that made you listen closely to every little sound. The way a squirrel's tiny feet skittered across the forest floor, or how the wind pushed through the treetops like a soft sigh. The colors around me felt richer, the sky a deep, clear blue during the day, and at night the stars came out so bright, it was like a blanket of tiny diamonds. The nights, though, were cold. I kept the fire going in the stove, the warmth chasing away the chill that crept under the doors and windows. I made simple meals, canned beans, bread, dried meat, and coffee brewed on a small camping stove. I read a lot, sat by the fire and thought. Felt good to be alone. On the third day, I noticed something odd. When I went out early in the morning to get water from the stream, I saw that the small trail leading from the cabin to the road had been disturbed. The leaves that had covered the path were pushed aside in some places. Not much, just enough to make me pause and look twice. I thought maybe an animal or a bird had been around, but the marks looked a little too much like footsteps. I shrugged it off. The woods were alive with animals, and the ground was soft from the recent rain, so footprints would be easy to see. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the quiet. That day, the weather started to change. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees sway hard. Dark clouds gathered over the hills, and by afternoon, a light rain began. It wasn't heavy, just a steady drizzle that made the leaves glisten and the air smelled damp and fresh. I stayed inside, reading and watching the rain slide down the windows. That evening, as the rain stopped and the sky cleared, I stepped outside to check the firewood. I noticed the ground around the cabin was softer, muddy from the rain. The leaves on the path were wetter, and the footprints were clearer. This time, I was sure they weren't animal prints. The shape was too big, like a heavy boot, and they were fresh. No leaves covering them, just wet earth pressed down. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet around me. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the soft sound of the wind through the trees. The prints led from the edge of the woods toward the cabin, then stopped near the back door. I locked all the doors and windows tightly and made sure the fire was burning strong inside. I kept the radio on, hoping for some news or music to keep me company. The next day was clear and sunny again. I told myself I was overthinking everything. Probably some hikers had walked by before the rain, and the prints were from them. The woods were a public place, after all, but I started to feel watched. When I went out for water that morning, I felt eyes on me. I looked around, but there was no one, just trees, rocks, and the small stream running clear and cold. I carried the water back quickly and shut the door behind me. During the day, I kept busy. I cleaned the cabin, stacked more wood, fixed a loose window latch, and tried to keep my mind off the strange feeling. The radio brought me some music and a weather report. No mention of any storms or anything unusual. At night, the wind returned, stronger this time. It shook the cabin, howled through the trees, and made the old wood creak loudly. I stayed close to the stove, watching the flames dance and hoping sleep would come easily. But it didn't. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up. I heard something outside. Footsteps crunching on the dry leaves near the back door. Slow, careful steps. I held my breath, frozen in the dark. The sound stopped, then moved to the side of the cabin. I could hear the faint rustle of branches. I thought about calling the police, but I had no signal. The cabin was too deep in the woods. I was completely alone. I grabbed the small hunting knife I kept for emergencies and sat quietly, waiting. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. The rest of the night was restless. I kept hearing small sounds, branches breaking, leaves crunching, something moving just beyond the trees. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted but relieved to see daylight. I decided to leave the cabin that day. I packed quickly, stacked the firewood, cleaned the stove, and locked everything up. As I walked to the car, I kept looking behind me. The forest was quiet, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. When I reached the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the back windshield, someone had written a single word in the dirt. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I started the car and drove away as fast as the dirt road would allow. The trees flew past me, and I didn't look back until I was well on the paved road. I told myself it was some prank. Someone from the nearby town, maybe trying to scare a city person like me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a joke. Over the next few days, I stayed in a motel near the town. I called the local sheriff's office and asked if anyone had reported strange people near the woods. They said no, but they warned me to be careful. Apparently, the area had some history of hikers getting lost or people breaking into cabins. I went back home and avoided the woods for months. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. Whoever had been near the cabin that night could have done much worse. They didn't try to break in, didn't shout or threaten me, just left that message and vanished. I never went back to that cabin. Instead, I kept the memories of the cold nights, the silence, the feeling of eyes watching me from the dark woods. The woods were beautiful, but they were also wild and full of secrets. Sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees near my city apartment, I remember the cabin, and I feel grateful to be safe, but also a little haunted by that week alone in the woods. I was 31 the summer I decided to take a break from my job as a plumber in Detroit. It was 2021, and the last year had been rough. Too many long hours, too many late nights, and too many houses that smelled like mildew and cigarettes. I'd saved up a little, just enough to take a few weeks off and get away from the city. A buddy of mine who used to hunt told me about a place he'd been years back, a small cabin near Higgins Lake in northern Michigan. Said it was remote, no neighbors for miles, perfect for peace and quiet. That's exactly what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for fun or excitement. I just wanted to sit somewhere quiet with no traffic, no phones, no news. I found the cabin listing on an old website that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. The photos were grainy, and the description was barely 2 paragraphs long. But it was cheap, and it was available for the whole month of July. I booked it, packed up my old Ford Ranger with enough supplies to last a month, and hit the road the next day. The drive took just over 4 hours. I rolled through Grayling, picked up a few more essentials, and headed into the woods. The paved road turned to gravel and then to dirt. Trees closed in on both sides. My GPS signal dropped off about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin. I wasn't worried. I had printed directions and brought a laminated map, just in case. The truck bounced over rocks and potholes. I drove another mile before I saw it, just past a bend in the road, nestled in the trees like it had been forgotten. It was smaller than I expected. The cabin was made of old, grayish wood, with a rusted metal roof and a porch that sagged in the middle. One window faced the driveway. The curtains were yellowed and half-drawn. I parked beside it and sat there for a second, just listening. No cars, no people, just wind in the trees and the creak of branches. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There was one room downstairs, a kitchen off to the side, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. A small wood stove sat in the corner with a pile of firewood next to it. There was no TV, no radio, and the power came from a gas generator out back. I didn't mind. I'd brought a few books, a portable battery pack, and a notebook. I wasn't planning to do much more than sit, walk, eat, and sleep. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I spent my mornings drinking instant coffee on the porch, watching the sun climb through the trees. I'd go for long walks in the woods, not on trails, just wandering, using my compass to keep from getting lost. I saw deer almost every morning. Once I saw a fox dart across a clearing. The nights were dead silent. I'd sit on the porch until the mosquitoes got too bad, then head inside and read until I fell asleep. By the 6th day, something small started to bother me. I'd gone out in the morning for a walk, followed the same path I had the day before. It led to a creek with some big rocks where I liked to sit. I was there for maybe 30 minutes. When I got back, I noticed that the can of coffee on the counter was open. Not just open, but the lid was off and sitting on the floor. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I chalked it up to being forgetful, maybe knocking it loose without realizing. 2 days later, I found a boot print by the generator. It wasn't mine. I'd been wearing the same hiking boots since I got there, thick tread, smaller size. This one was flatter, wider. It looked fresh too, like it had been made that morning. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, heart thudding in my chest. But I didn't hear anything. No branches snapping, no voices, just wind. That night, I stayed up late. I didn't light a fire, didn't turn on any lights. I just sat in the dark, listening. I kept the shotgun I'd brought leaned against the wall next to me. I didn't usually keep it loaded, but that night I did. Nothing happened. The next morning, I circled the cabin, looking for more prints. I didn't find any, but when I checked my truck, the driver's door was unlocked. I always lock it. I keep the spare key under the wheel well, and it was still there, but now it looked like it had been moved. A bit of dirt smeared across the magnet case, like someone had picked it up and put it back. I opened the door and checked everything inside. Nothing missing. Glove box still shut. Everything where I left it. That evening, I rigged a little trap. Just fishing line tied across the steps leading up to the porch. If someone came up while I was sleeping, I'd hear them. It was a dumb idea, but it gave me peace of mind. I also leaned a stick against the door, balanced loosely so it'd fall if it opened. Then I went to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't hear anything, but I knew something was off. I laid there in the dark, eyes open, waiting. After a while, I got up and checked the door. The stick was still there, but the fishing line was gone. Just gone. The ends had been cut, clean, like someone used a knife. I stepped outside and scanned the trees with a flashlight, heart pounding. Nothing. No sound, no movement. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I packed up some gear, grabbed the map, and drove out to the nearest ranger station. I told them someone might be messing around out by the cabin. They took my name, asked a few questions, and said they'd send someone out in a day or two. They didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably a local, maybe a poacher or a bored teenager. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing up and driving home. But something stubborn in me didn't want to give up. I wasn't about to let some creep scare me off. I'd paid for the month, and I had 2 more weeks left. That night, I slept in the loft with the shotgun next to me. I didn't bother setting traps. I just stayed awake and listened. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady, crunching through the brush, then stopping. I held my breath. The footsteps started again, this time moving toward the back of the cabin. Then nothing. Silence. I waited for what felt like an hour before I dared to move. The next morning, I found something behind the cabin. A piece of rope, tied between 2 trees about waist high. It looked like a trip line. I wouldn't have noticed it if the sun hadn't caught the nylon just right. I followed the rope with my eyes and saw that it ran to a small tin can hidden in a bush. Some kind of makeshift alarm. It hadn't gone off, though. It was still hanging, empty. I felt sick. Someone was watching me, not just passing through. Watching me. I packed up again and drove back to the ranger station, but this time it was closed. I left a note on the door, stuffed it into the crack between the boards. I told them everything. Then I drove back, but instead of staying at the cabin, I parked down the road and waited. I wanted to see if anyone would show up. I sat in my truck for 5 hours. Just before sunset, I saw movement in the trees near the cabin. Figure moving low, crouched. They had a backpack and what looked like a baseball cap. I couldn't see their face. They crept around the back, paused by the window, then disappeared behind the cabin. I turned the engine and drove toward the clearing, tires spinning in the dirt. When I pulled in, the figure bolted, ran straight into the woods. I jumped out and chased, but they were faster. I lost them in seconds. I didn't go back inside. I drove to a motel in Grayling and spent the night there. The next morning, I returned with a sheriff's deputy. We searched the area. They found more trip lines, another can alarm, and a tarp rolled up under a pile of brush about 20 yards from the cabin. Under it was a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a pair of binoculars. Someone had been living there, watching me. They never found out who it was. No fingerprints, no name. They guessed it was a squatter or a drifter, maybe someone hiding out from something. The deputy offered to stay while I packed up. I took only what I needed. left the food, the firewood, the books. I haven't gone back since. I still think about it sometimes. How quiet it was, how close they must have been while I slept, how long they might have been watching me before I noticed. I didn't see their face, I didn't hear their voice, but I still feel like they knew everything about me by the time I left. What time I slept, what paths I took in the woods, what supplies I brought. They were careful, smart, patient. I don't rent cabins anymore. I don't go into the woods unless it's a campground with other people nearby. And even then, I double-check every lock, every window. I don't sleep easy out there. Not anymore. I learned that fear doesn't always come with a sound or a shadow. Sometimes it's a pair of eyes in the trees. Sometimes it's knowing that someone was there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to do something worse. But I left before they got that chance. I left when I still could, and that's what matters. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to rent a small cabin up in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I was 34 back then, single, and working remotely as a freelance graphic designer. I had just wrapped up a big contract and wanted to take some time to disconnect from everything. No phone, no emails, no people. Just trees, wind, and the sound of birds or whatever else lived out in the forest. I booked the cabin online through a small local rental website. It wasn't fancy or commercial, just a simple listing with some photos and a short description. The place was cheap and isolated, about 20 miles outside the small town of Indian Lake. It didn't have Wi-Fi, and the owner warned that cell service was unreliable. That was exactly what I was looking for. I drove up there in my black 2012 Subaru Outback. The drive took around 5 hours from my apartment in Jersey City. Most of it was highway, but the last stretch was rough, gravel roads full of potholes that shook the car every few seconds. I didn't see another car for a good 45 minutes as I got deeper into the forest. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was dipping low, around 6:30 p.m. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and everything felt still. No engine sounds, no voices, no distant hum of traffic, just wind moving through the branches. The cabin itself was small and plain, built from dark-stained logs, with a tin roof and a tiny porch. There were 2 steps leading up to the front door, which had a screen door that creaked on its hinges. Inside, it was even more basic. A twin-size bed pushed against the wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen area with a gas stove and a sink, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. There was no bathroom inside, just an outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. That part made me a bit uneasy, but I told myself it was part of the experience. I stored my groceries, unloaded my duffel bag, and placed my flashlight and pocket knife on the table. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet, like the forest had hit pause. That first night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't fear, just unfamiliarity. I could hear raccoons moving around outside and the occasional snap of branches under something heavier than a squirrel. The bed was stiff and smelled faintly of mildew. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the shadowy ceiling beams while listening to the sounds of the woods. I finally dozed off sometime around 3 a.m., only to wake up at sunrise. The light came in through the slatted blinds and warmed the wooden floor. It was peaceful, at least on the surface. The first 2 days were normal enough. I spent the mornings hiking the trails nearby and the afternoons reading or sketching. There were no other cabins in sight. The forest around the place was thick with old trees and the ground was layered with pine needles, moss, and fallen branches. I followed a narrow path that wound around a small lake about a mile away. I brought a thermos and sat by the shore, watching ducks and the occasional fish break the surface. There were insects, but nothing overwhelming. At night, I'd light the gas lamp and write in my notebook or stare at the fire in the stove until I got tired enough to sleep. It was boring in a good way. The third night is when things started to feel off. It began small, just noises that didn't match what I'd been hearing before. Not animals scurrying or the wind in the trees, but slower, heavier steps outside, 2 or 3 at a time, then silence. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a bear. I stayed in bed and listened. The steps came again about 10 minutes later, closer this time, followed by the faint creak of the porch step. Then nothing. I held my breath. I didn't hear the door move, didn't hear the screen squeak, just silence for what felt like forever. I got up and looked out the window but saw nothing. The woods were too dark. I convinced myself it was an animal and went back to bed, gripping my flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. The next morning, I found a footprint in the dirt in front of the porch. It was from a boot, not a paw, and it was recent. I crouched and looked closer. The soil was soft from rain the night before, and the tread was clear, definitely a person's boot. But I hadn't seen a single person since I got here. No hikers, no campers, nothing. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. I found 3 more prints, going off into the trees toward the east. They weren't deep like someone had been running, just placed deliberately, almost casually. I couldn't tell how far they went. The ground got harder and rockier past a certain point, and the trail ended. I stood there in the silence, staring at the trees, feeling like something was staring back. That afternoon, I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to the cabin, checking all the windows and making sure the door lock worked. It did, but it was old and loose. I slid one of the kitchen chairs under the handle just in case. I didn't have cell service, but I opened my phone to check the time, 3:17 p.m. I tried sending a message to my brother just for peace of mind, but it didn't go through. I spent the rest of the day uneasy, jumping at every snapping twig outside. When the sun went down, I turned off the gas lamp early and sat in the dark. I didn't want anyone or anything knowing I was awake. I didn't even light the stove. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, crunching on the gravel. They circled the cabin once. I could tell because I heard them fade, then return from the other side. Whoever it was didn't try to get in, didn't knock, didn't say a word. Just walked around and then disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright on the bed with the knife in one hand and flashlight in the other until the sky started to lighten. That morning, I found more prints. The same boots, the same casual stride, but this time they led up to the outhouse and then back into the trees. The door to the outhouse was slightly open. I never left it that way. I stood there staring at it for a while before I walked over and looked inside. Nothing unusual, just the same pit toilet and smell. No sign anyone had used it, but that didn't calm me. I decided I'd leave the next day. I had enough food for one more night, and I told myself I'd wake up early, pack, and head out. That day dragged. I couldn't focus on anything. Every noise felt like a warning. I packed my bag before the sun even set and kept everything by the door. I didn't light any lamps. I sat on the floor behind the bed where I couldn't be seen from the windows. I kept the knife ready. My mouth was dry, and my legs ached from being crouched so long, but I didn't move. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps again. They were slower this time. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. I didn't dare look out the window. Then I heard the screen door creak. A light press against the main door. Not a knock, just wait. The handle jiggled softly, then stopped. After a few minutes, the steps moved away again. I stayed frozen in place until daylight. When I finally opened the door, I saw a new footprint on the top porch step and a long scrape on the wooden door, like someone had dragged something metal across it. I didn't eat breakfast. I just threw everything in the car and left. I didn't stop to check the woods. I didn't look back at the cabin. I drove too fast on the gravel roads, bouncing through potholes until I hit pavement. Once I got back into cell range, my phone exploded with messages. None were important, just missed calls and some updates. I didn't respond. I drove straight to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin at night? That I heard footsteps? That doesn't sound like much, but I know what I felt. That wasn't a random hiker. That wasn't a bear or a lost camper. Whoever was out there knew I was alone. They watched me. Maybe they were waiting for something, waiting for me to leave the door unlocked or go out at night. I think if I'd stayed one more day, they might have tried to come inside. It's been years, and I haven't gone camping since. I still think about that trip whenever I hear footsteps outside my apartment. Sometimes I dream about that cabin, about sitting in the dark with the knife in my hand, afraid to breathe. I don't think it was a ghost or some mythical forest creature. I think it was a man, just a regular man who liked to watch people alone in the woods. And that's what scares me the most. I was 31 when I spent that long weekend alone in a cabin outside of Pendleton, Oregon. It was the spring of 2017, early May, and I remember the weather was just starting to warm up. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress from work. At the time, I was doing freelance construction work in Eugene, and I just wrapped up a messy home remodel that went way over schedule. Between fighting with the client and managing subcontractors who never showed up on time, I was burned out. I needed a break from everything, no emails, no phones, no people. I found the cabin listing through an old buddy who had stayed there a year before. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. It was this off-the-grid spot that a retired forestry worker named Harris owned. He didn't live in it anymore, but he kept it stocked and said people could stay there if they wanted peace and quiet. You just had to leave $50 under a rock by the mailbox at the end of the gravel road. It was one of those honor system places, and that sounded perfect to me. The cabin was about an hour and a half northeast of Pendleton, tucked way out in the woods past a bunch of old logging trails. The road that led to it was rough, barely passable in some spots, but my old Toyota Tacoma made it just fine. The place itself was simple. A single-story wooden cabin with a small front porch, a tin roof, and one chimney poking up through the side. It had solar panels on the roof and a backup generator in a little shack out back. No cell service, no neighbors, no Wi-Fi. Inside, there was one main room with a kitchen against the back wall, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a worn-out couch that faced the window. Off to the right, a door led to a bedroom with a twin bed and a narrow closet. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. It was exactly what I needed. I dropped my duffel on the bed, went back out to the truck, and unloaded the groceries and gear I brought. Mostly canned food, oatmeal, a camp stove, a folding chair, and a couple of paperback books I'd been meaning to read. That first day was peaceful. I chopped some wood, cooked a simple dinner, and sat on the porch with a beer while the sun dipped behind the hills. The only sound was the wind rustling through the pine trees. I remember feeling a kind of deep stillness that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the kind of quiet that you only find way out in the woods, far from roads and cities. That night, I slept hard. No traffic, no phones buzzing, just the sound of frogs outside and the creak of the old cabin settling into the cool night. I woke up once around 3 a.m. because of a thud on the porch. It startled me, but I figured it was probably a branch or maybe a raccoon getting into the trash bin. I didn't have a flashlight by the bed, so I didn't bother checking it out. The next morning, I found the trash can tipped over and a few torn-up wrappers scattered on the ground. Could have been any animal. I cleaned it up and moved the can into the generator shed so it'd be harder to get to. Then I made a pot of instant coffee and sat out front again. The trees swayed slowly in the breeze, and the air had that sharp, fresh smell that you only get in the mountains after sunrise. I spent that whole day hiking around the area. There were no trails, so I just followed a dry creek bed north for about 1.5 miles before circling back. I found an old fire pit surrounded by flat rocks and what looked like an abandoned hunting blind built into a thicket of brush. It was mostly just planks nailed between trees, weather-worn and collapsing. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. That night, I cooked some beans and rice, read about 30 pages of my book, and went to bed early. It was around midnight when I heard something outside again. This time it wasn't a thud. It was lighter, more deliberate. I laid still in bed, holding my breath, trying to figure out if it was just wind or animals again. The sound came in short bursts like someone or something was stepping on dry leaves just past the porch. Not stomping, just slow, cautious footsteps. I waited for a minute or two. The sound stopped. I got up quietly and stepped out into the living room. I kept all the lights off. Through the window, I couldn't see anything, but the moon was bright enough to light up the tree line about 20 yards out. Everything looked still. I stood there for another 10 minutes, watching. Nothing moved. Eventually, I went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I circled the cabin, looking for prints or signs that anything had been out there. I found nothing. No fresh tracks, no disturbed leaves. It made me feel a little crazy. Maybe I was just jumpy. I hadn't been truly alone like that in a long time, and the silence plays tricks on your ears after a while. Still, I kept the axe by the door after that. That afternoon, I hiked in the opposite direction from the day before, hoping to find a ridge I'd seen from the porch. I eventually found it. The view was great. Rolling hills, deep forest, no roads or buildings as far as the eye could see. On the way back, though, I noticed something strange. About 100 yards from the cabin, tucked into a patch of thicker woods, I saw the faint outline of a path I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't much, just a narrow line through the brush where the grass was lower and some of the branches looked like they'd been broken more recently. I followed it for a few dozen steps before hitting a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across. In the center was an old stump, surrounded by small stones. It looked like someone had tried to build a fire ring there, but it hadn't been used in a while. I turned around and walked back. I didn't think much of it until later that night. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up again. This time it was something sharp. A crack, like a branch snapping, followed by quick, deliberate steps near the side of the cabin. Then silence. Not the sound of an animal rooting around, not the random thump of something falling. This was rhythmic, measured. I sat up and listened hard, barely breathing. Then another sound. Something brushed against the wooden wall. Not hard, but enough to make the old boards creak faintly. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the table. I didn't turn it on yet. I waited again, but the sounds didn't come back. I unlocked the front door and slowly eased it open, shining the light around the porch and the clearing beyond. Nothing. I stepped off the porch, heart pounding in my ears, and walked a slow circle around the cabin. Still nothing. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 10 feet from the back wall of the cabin, someone or something had stuck a small pile of twigs into the dirt, upright, in a careful little bundle. It wasn't natural. The twigs were sharpened at one end, like little stakes, and arranged in a kind of triangle. I kicked them over and scanned the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching. I packed up a day early. I'd planned on staying until Sunday, but this was Saturday morning, and I'd had enough. I loaded everything into the truck and locked up the cabin. On the way out, as I drove down the bumpy dirt road, I saw fresh tire tracks on a side path I hadn't noticed before. The path curved off into the trees behind the cabin, like it led somewhere deeper in the woods. The tracks looked recent. I stopped the truck and got out to look. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and I could see where someone had driven in maybe the night before. The tires were narrow, like from an ATV or a dirt bike. I didn't follow them. I got back in and kept driving, glancing in the rearview mirror more than usual. Back in Pendleton, I called Harris, the guy who owned the cabin. I told him someone might have been messing around out there. He sounded tired and didn't say much, just told me I wasn't the first person to mention strange stuff. He said he hadn't been out there in over a year and might just take the listing down altogether. 2 weeks later, I read a local news article about an illegal grow site that was busted about 3 miles from that cabin. Deputies found a campsite, some traps, and evidence that people had been living out there. No arrests were made, and they said the people responsible probably moved on after getting spooked. I remembered the sharpened twigs, the noises at night, and the feeling that someone was always nearby. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Whoever had been out there wasn't some random camper. They didn't want people near their spot. I was lucky nothing worse happened. I haven't been back to that part of Oregon since. I still camp and hike sometimes, but I stay in designated spots now, places with other people nearby. The kind of isolation I thought I needed wasn't worth the risk. Out in the woods, especially alone, it doesn't take much for things to go wrong. And when they do, no one hears you. That cabin's probably still there, empty and quiet, just waiting for someone else to wander in. But I never will. In the fall of 2017, I was 33 years old and working in a small repair shop in Fargo, North Dakota. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and didn't have many close friends either. I liked being alone most of the time. I wasn't lonely. At least that's what I told myself. I just liked peace, quiet, and being away from people for a while. That year, I decided to take a week off work and spend it in a remote cabin I had found online. It was deep in the woods near Ely, Minnesota, not far from the edge of the Boundary Waters. The pictures showed a small, one-bedroom wooden cabin with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a dock stretching out into a quiet lake. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no one around for miles. Just what I wanted. I rented it through an old guy named Walter who had been running it for years. He didn't say much in the emails other than giving me directions and saying the place was stocked with firewood and basics like canned food, matches, and some bottled water. He said there was a well with a hand pump and an outhouse out back. Simple living. I packed my old pickup with a cooler of food, some basic tools, a sleeping bag, and a rifle just in case. Not for people, more for coyotes or maybe a bear if it came to it. I also brought a heavy lockbox with cash and documents, since I didn't want to leave that stuff behind at home while I was gone. I figured I'd keep it tucked in a closet at the cabin. I arrived in Ely just before sunset on a Saturday and followed a narrow dirt road into the trees. After about 30 minutes, the road turned rough, with roots and rocks making it a slow crawl. My GPS had lost signal 10 miles back. I was relying on Walter's printed instructions, which said to look for a rusted metal mailbox with the number 42 spray painted on the side. Then take a right onto an old logging trail. That part was easy to miss. It looked more like a wide game path than a road. I followed it slowly for another mile or so, and then I saw the cabin, just like in the pictures. It sat about 50 yards from the lake, tucked among tall pines. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. No birdsong, no wind, just the crunch of my tires on old gravel and the creak of the wooden cabin as it settled in the cool evening air. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening. It was strange how isolated it felt. I liked that. I stepped out, stretched, and walked up the short path to the cabin. The front door had an old-fashioned latch with a padlock. The key Walter mailed me worked fine, and the door opened with a soft groan. Inside, it smelled like dry wood, dust, and a little mildew. There was a narrow bed pushed against the wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a metal stove in the corner. The kitchen was just a counter with an old propane stove, a few shelves with mismatched plates and utensils, and a row of canned food. There was a kerosene lamp and a box of matches, along with a few candles. I lit the lamp, dropped my bags on the bed, and started unpacking. By the time I was settled, it was dark. I heated some chili on the stove, ate at the little table, then stepped outside to take in the stars. The lake was perfectly still, black as ink, and the sky was clear. You could see more stars than I ever saw back home. I stood there for a while, just breathing the cold air, listening to the woods, trying to soak it in. Then I locked the door, shut off the lamp, and went to bed. I woke up early the next morning to birds chirping outside. It was cold. I got the stove going with some of the dry wood stacked in the corner and heated up some coffee on the propane burner. I spent most of that day fishing off the dock, walking the tree line, and reading a book I brought. The whole point was to be bored, to be alone, to get away. That night was just as quiet as the first. I started feeling relaxed in a way I hadn't in years. But on the 3rd day, something changed. It started with small things. When I came back from the lake that afternoon, I noticed the front door wasn't fully closed. I was sure I had latched it. Not locked, but latched. I brushed it off, figured maybe the wind caught it or I hadn't shut it as well as I thought. But later that evening, I noticed the box of matches I kept on the kitchen shelf was missing. I checked my bag, checked the table, the floor, nothing. I still had the other box near the bed, so I figured I must have misplaced it. Again, I let it go. I lit a candle, made some soup, and tried not to let my mind run. The next morning, I found tracks outside the cabin. They were human, no shoes, just bare footprints in the cold mud near the well. That made my stomach twist. It had dropped close to freezing overnight. Who the hell was out here barefoot? I followed them for a few yards. They came from the woods, stopped at the well, then disappeared back into the trees. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, real fear. I had brought the rifle more for show than anything, but I checked it now, loaded it, and kept it near me the rest of the day. I didn't go fishing. I stayed inside, listening. Every sound outside made me freeze. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and dragged the small dresser in front of it. I left the lamp burning low and sat on the bed with the rifle across my lap. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the floor creak. Not outside, inside. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Another creak came from near the kitchen. I held my breath, staring into the dim shadows. I didn't move. I waited for minutes, maybe more. Nothing. I got up slowly, walked to the kitchen with the rifle raised. There was no one there. The back window was shut. I stood still, listening. My ears were ringing from the silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked everything. The door was still locked. The window was still shut. Nothing broken. But I found something else. A small piece of cloth caught in the splintered corner of the window frame. It was gray and dirty, like an old t-shirt scrap. That window didn't open all the way, just tilted out. Someone had been trying to open it from the outside and got caught. That was enough for me. I packed my bag, loaded my gear, and locked up. I didn't want to spend another night there. I started driving back out, following the same rough trail I came in on. But after 20 minutes, I reached a fallen tree that hadn't been there before. A thick pine trunk, fresh, green needles still on the branches. It had been cut clean with a saw, not by storm. Someone had dropped it across the path. It was too big to move. I tried backing up, but the trail was too narrow to turn around. I had to drive in reverse for half a mile until I found a wide enough spot to turn around. I drove back to the cabin, rattled, panicked. I kept checking the rearview mirror, thinking I'd see someone walking the trail behind me. I didn't. Once I got back, I stayed outside, pacing, thinking. I could hike out maybe 8 miles to the main road, but I didn't want to leave my truck. I had food, water, shelter. I decided to wait a day, then try again. Maybe it was some prank. Maybe someone was trying to scare me off. I stayed alert that whole day, watching the woods. That night, it got worse. I sat with the lamp low and the rifle ready. Around midnight, I heard a soft scraping sound outside the back wall, near the outhouse. Then it stopped. Then another noise, a tap, like fingers on glass. The back window. I didn't move. Then the sound of feet walking slowly across the porch. I raised the rifle and aimed at the door. No knock, no voice, just footsteps. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. I didn't sleep. I sat until dawn. When the sun came up, I walked outside, rifle in hand. Nothing, but there were footprints again, bare feet. They circled the cabin, stopped at the window and the porch. I followed them around the side and saw something new carved into the wood beside the window. A single word, scratched deep with something sharp. Asterisk, asterisk, stay, asterisk, asterisk. That was the last straw. I locked everything again, stuffed everything valuable in the truck, and started hiking. I took the rifle and a heavy flashlight and began moving fast along the trail. It took hours, but I finally reached the main road, flagged down a logging truck, and got a ride back into town. I reported everything to the local sheriff. He took notes, asked questions, then said he'd send someone out. I never heard back about it. I called Walter, furious, and told him everything. He didn't sound surprised, just said sorry, and that he'd refund the rest of my stay. That was it. A week later, I saw a listing online. Same cabin, same photos, same description. Still available for rent. Still isolated. Still quiet. I never went back. I kept thinking about that word scratched into the wood. Not leave, not go, but stay. Like it wasn't a threat. Like it was a warning. Maybe someone else had stayed there and vanished. Maybe someone was living in those woods, watching renters, sneaking in, getting closer each night. I still think about those bare footprints, the piece of cloth, the door slightly open. How close someone must have been, right on the other side of the wall while I slept. I keep the rifle near my bed now. I had been drawn to quiet places ever since childhood, and by the autumn of 2022, I felt more restless than ever in the crowded rental I shared with two friends in Boston. At 31, too old for dorm-style living yet too broke to buy my own place, I spent most evenings searching listings for isolated getaways. The cabin I finally chose stood near the southern edge of a long finger of water called Spencer Cove, about 10 miles north of Moosehead Lake in northern Maine. Photos showed gray cedar walls, a steep metal roof, and a single gravel drive that vanished into trees so dense they looked almost black. The owner wrote that it had no television, patchy cell reception, and electricity fed by a line that often failed in storms. Those warnings felt like promises. I booked 3 weeks, tossed my notebooks, camera, and trail shoes into the back of my aging Subaru, and started north on the first clear Friday of October. The drive took 5 hours. By the time I crossed the town line into Greenville, the gas station lights had flickered on for the night, and a low mist drifted over the road like smoke. I filled the tank, bought instant coffee and a loaf of bread, and pushed on. The pavement narrowed to cracked tar, then faded to crushed stone that popped under my wheels. For the last 3 miles, I crawled in first gear. Spruce and fir trunks hemmed the road so tightly their branches brushed both mirrors. When my GPS lost signal, the screen froze on a blue dot surrounded by nothing at all, confirming I had reached the edge of its knowledge. Another 2 bends brought me to a rust-stained mailbox leaning against a fallen birch. A wooden sign below it read Kestrel Point, 1,110 feet. The gravel track beyond dipped, twisted left, and ended in a clearing just wide enough to turn around. The cabin stood at the clearing's far side, half hidden by overgrown blueberry bushes. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 25 feet long and 18 deep, with a single front window and a rough-cut door secured by a black iron latch. No other buildings broke the sweep of trees around me. I killed the engine and let the quiet settle. It felt thick, almost physical, a hush made of pine needles and soft ground. In that moment, I realized how far I was from help if anything went wrong, and the thought thrilled me more than it frightened me. Inside, I found a single room divided only by furniture. Iron stove, battered sofa, pine table, open shelves holding mismatched pans, and a ladder that climbed to a sleeping loft. The air smelled of ash, cold iron, and dry wood. I switched on the ceiling light. A weak yellow glow spread, then flickered as though the bulb might fail. I unpacked in silence, stacking notebooks on the table, filling a plastic tub with groceries beneath it, and spreading my sleeping bag across the loft's narrow mattress. Wind hissed through gaps in the logs, raising a draft that cooled the sweat on my arms. I built a small fire, boiled water, and ate bread torn in rough pieces. When the flames settled into coals, I climbed to the loft and lay listening. No voices, no engines, only the occasional crack of wood shrinking in the stove and, far away, something that could have been a loon crying over the water. I slept hard until a pale beam of sunrise slipped between the logs. During the first 2 days, I learned the cabin's rhythm. Morning sunlight filtered through spruce branches, casting moving bars of gold across the walls. Chipmunks scolded from deadfall near the porch. A single red squirrel seemed to claim ownership of the entire clearing and made angry loops around my boots each time I carried wood inside. I hiked a rough trail that circled the cove, noting where the soil dipped into marsh and where rocks could turn an ankle. No one else's boot prints pressed the damp ground, though once I saw what looked like a stray dog's wide pad marks near the lake, already softening at the edges under dew. I sketched outlines of pine trunks in my notebook, wrote 6 pages of reflections meant for a travel essay, and spent long stretches simply standing on the porch, breathing in resin and cold air that carried nothing human. Late on the 3rd afternoon, I walked to collect dead branches from beyond the clearing. Sun angled low, lighting every cobweb between the ferns. When I returned, the cabin door stood ajar. I remembered locking it. For a long minute, I waited outside, heartbeat hammering, convinced I would see someone step into the doorway. Nothing moved. I crept forward, felt the latch with shaking fingers, and noted the pin was fully extended, not thrown back as it would be if the strike plate had been pressed. The door must have swung on its own, I reasoned, pushed by air when I closed it too lightly. I convinced myself of that, though sleep came slow that night. Each time a pine cone thumped the roof, I woke sharp, heart galloping. On the fifth morning, a hard frost rimed every blade of grass. I pulled on 2 sweaters and took my camera toward the shoreline, hoping to catch the sun lifting through fog. When I returned an hour later, I saw fresh tracks crossing mine. They weren't dog prints now. They were boot imprints, plain as day, the waffle pattern deep enough to judge good tread. They came from the road, crossed to the cabin's north wall, paused under the single window, then veered into the woods behind the outhouse. I followed 20 yards before the press of trees forced me to crouch, squint, and lose the line among fallen needles. I tried to believe a hunter had wandered close without malice, but no human voice or engine broke the silence all day. That evening, I dragged a metal storage box across the porch and wedged it against the door, weight enough to stop a shove from outside. I cut kindling in 10-inch strips of spruce, stacking them like miniature logs beside the stove. They would serve just as well as clubs if I needed them. A storm rolled in on day 6, carried by wind that smelled of raw lake water and wet moss. Rain fell with such force the roof vibrated. The power died just after nightfall, taking the weak electric lamps with it. I lit 2 stubby candles, placed one on each windowsill, and sat on the floor, back to the wall, knees up, waiting for whatever might come next. Near midnight, a crack sounded at the porch edge, like someone stepping on a rotten board. A minute later, the storage box scraped against the door. My throat locked. I held the fireplace poker in both hands, eyes glued to the latch. It trembled once, let out a dry click, then stopped. The box shifted again, metal rasping wood, as though nudged by something that lacked steady strength. I stayed frozen until dawn light replaced candle glow, only then daring to ease the door open. Rain had turned the clearing to mud, washing away prints, but the box bore a smear of dirt on its side at ankle level. Too high for the squirrel, too low for a man who walked steady. Maybe a black bear had sniffed for food, I told myself, though the thought gave little comfort. That afternoon, I drove 20 miles south to a ranger outpost that served as emergency station for hikers. The building sat on stilts above a slope of granite, radio antenna piercing the clouds. Inside, I located a map to mark the cabin's position and flipped through a logbook where visitors noted wildlife sightings. Nobody had listed unusual animal behavior in weeks. The Lone Ranger on duty offered me a mug of powdered coffee. He explained that bears mostly foraged lower this time of year and that break-ins happened, though not often so far off the Maine lake. Hearing him say it did nothing to calm me. I thanked him, bought 2 new batteries for my headlamp, and returned before dusk. The next 2 nights passed in wary watchfulness, broken by snatches of sleep too brief to dream. Something snapped branches near the outhouse just before sunrise both mornings. I pictured a deer shifting through brush, but the pattern and volume of the cracks suggested heavier weight, deliberate motion, not the random nibbling of an herbivore. Afternoons, I walked the trail holding a length of ash I had peeled and sanded smooth, listening for any sign I was followed. At times, I sensed eyes on the back of my neck, and once I caught a glimpse of gray fabric among the furs, gone before I could fix the image. On the 9th evening, the air dropped below freezing again, thick with a smell like iron. I stoked the stove high, loaded the poker and 2 of the short spruce strips beside my nest of blankets, and set my headlamp within arm's reach. Around 1 a.m., I woke to tapping on glass, light, rhythmic, almost curious. Spine rigid, I sat up. The headlamp beam revealed 4 fingertip smudges high on the window, just mounting up on the condensate. My breath caught in my throat. I extinguished the beam at once. Whoever stood outside could see its glare. Blind now, I strained every sense. The tapping stopped. Silence folded tight around the cabin until a crunch sounded on the far side. Then another at the porch. The storage box scraped louder than before. I heard my own pulse in my ears. The latch shuddered. Wood creaked. Then a metallic ping announced a nail lifting from the frame. I remembered the owner's warning about the door. The frame was old, the hinge screws shallow. Someone who came prepared might work the planks free without needing to break a panel. I could not wait. I crawled to the stove, swung the poker until the tip glowed dull red,